Most people think they know this place, a palace of excess perched on a lonely California hill, a monument to the colossal ego of a newspaper tycoon. They see the glimmering pools, the gilded ceilings, the stolen treasures of Europe, and they see a story of wealth. They are wrong. This was never a home. It was a fortress, an act of defiance against an enemy no army could defeat. For 28 years, William Randolph Hearst, the man who directed the thoughts of a nation, poured a vast fortune into this remote kingdom he called the Ranch. The world, however, would come to know it by a different name, a fictional name given to it by the one man who dared to expose its master, Xanadu. That ghost, born in a dark movie theater, has haunted this hill for 80 years, obscuring a much stranger and more desperate truth. The accepted history is a facade, as carefully constructed as the Spanish cathedral that serves as its main gate. But the archives, the letters, the blueprints, they don't speak of ego. They whisper of fear. Why here? Why build a kingdom in the absolute middle of nowhere, a place so isolated it required its own private railway and airfield just to be reached? Why did the construction never cease, with entire wings built only to be torn down and rebuilt on a whim? Was it a search for perfection or the frantic energy of a man trying to outrun the inevitable? And the darkest question of all, why was one simple word forbidden on this entire mountain? Guests were warned, staff were trained. The word death was never to be spoken. We have been sold the story of a man who wanted to own the world. But what if the truth is that he was simply terrified of leaving it? What if this entire castle, with all its art and all its glamour, was not a monument to a life, but a desperate, sprawling, multi-million-dollar wall built against the silent terror of the grave? What secret was so profound that a king of media spent his life trying to bury it in stone, only to have it immortalized on film by his greatest enemy? The official story is a masterpiece of mythology. It's the legend of the Sun King on his California mountain. We are told that Hearst Castle is the singular, explosive vision of one man, William Randolph Hearst, the larger-than-life media tycoon who bent the world to his will and then built a palace to celebrate the fact. This narrative is simple, clean, and powerful. It fits the American obsession with the lone genius, the eccentric billionaire whose every whim is transformed into concrete reality. The castle in this telling is not a building. It is a monument to an ego, a personal playground constructed on what he called the Enchanted Hill. But this story, the one sold on postcards and in glossy guidebooks, is a carefully edited draft of the truth. It intentionally omits the most critical name in the entire saga, a name that belongs not to the man who paid the bills, but to the quiet, relentless mind that made the impossible possible. That name is Julia Morgan. To call her Hearst's architect is to call a general a soldier. Morgan was a force of nature in her own right. In an era when the field was almost exclusively male, she became the first woman to be licensed as an architect in the state of California. This was not a token position. It was a declaration of war on the status quo. For 28 years, she was the operational commander of La Cuesta Encantada. Hearst provided the chaotic stream of consciousness, the dreams, the ever-changing demands, the extravagant whims. He would send a telegram demanding a wing be torn down, or that a 15th century Spanish ceiling he just bought in Europe be incorporated into a new structure. It was Morgan who had to make it work. She was the one who solved the colossal engineering and logistical puzzles that came with building a European city on a remote, water-starved hilltop. Her calm, methodical competence was the essential counterweight to Hearst's volatile creativity. He was the fantasy. She was the physics. This was not a simple client-contractor relationship. It was a complex, decades-long partnership between two fundamentally different personalities bound by a shared obsession. The endless flow of blueprints, letters, and telegrams between them tells the true story. It's a story of collaboration, negotiation, and sheer endurance. The legend of Hearst Castle focuses on the treasures he imported from across the globe. But the real treasure was the mind of the woman who could orchestrate it all. She managed armies of craftsmen, sourced ancient and modern materials, and designed the very infrastructure, the roads, the water systems, the power that allowed the fantasy to exist. Therefore, our investigation cannot begin with the man who wanted the castle. It must begin with the woman who actually built it. To understand this place, we must push past the myth of the solitary king and uncover the story of his indispensable master builder. The truth of the castle is not in what it represents, but in how it came to be. The truth of the castle is not in what it represents, but in how it came to be. And the how of its creation is inseparable from the where. Before a single stone was laid, before Julia Morgan drew a single line, a decision was made that would define the entire project for the next 3 decades. The choice of location. On the surface, the choice of San Simeon appears to be driven by pure sentiment. The official history tells us this land was a legacy. It was a vast, 40,000-acre tract of rugged California coastline purchased by Hearst's father, the mining baron George Hearst, back in 1865. This was the landscape of William's childhood. He had camped here with his family on the hill they affectionately called Camp Hill. It was a place of fond memories, of open skies and wind-swept pastures overlooking the Pacific. A nostalgic return to a simpler time. But sentiment explains a cottage. It does not explain a fortress. The decision to build here was not an act of nostalgia. It was a profound strategic calculation. One must look not at the family photo album, but at a topographical map to understand the real motive. The site sits 1,600 feet above the ocean, a sovereign peak with commanding views for miles in every direction. It is profoundly, almost aggressively, isolated. This was not a flaw in the plan, it was the entire point. It established a natural barrier between Hearst's world and the one he sought to escape. This remoteness was an instrument. To reach the castle, one had to be invited. Guests would typically travel by Hearst's private train to a station in San Luis Obispo, then be driven for hours along winding coastal roads, and finally begin the slow 5-mile ascent up the private mountain road. This was not a visit. It was a pilgrimage, and it served a distinct purpose. It stripped visitors of their autonomy. Once on the hill, you were in Hearst's domain, subject to his schedule and his rules. You could not simply leave. The geography itself enforced his control. This was not a home designed for easy living or convenient access. This was the seat of a private kingdom, and its geography was its constitution. The isolation was the first and most important law. The location was the first and most powerful instrument of control. But location, powerful as it is merely an instrument, a tool to control the movement of people in physical space. This entire project, this sprawling act of will, was designed to control something far more elusive. To understand the castle, you have to ask a fundamental question. What does a man who controls a media empire, who can start wars and shape public opinion with a headline, truly fear? The answer isn't a rival, an army, or a market crash. The enemy Hearst was fighting was mortality itself. The evidence for this is not written in stone, but in the silence that permeated the entire estate. There was a rule at La Cuesta Encantada, an absolute decree understood by every guest and servant. One word was forbidden. In this kingdom of opulence and endless conversation, the word death was never to be spoken. To utter it was to summon the very spectre Hearst was spending his fortune to keep at bay. This reveals the core of our investigation. The castle was not a celebration of life, it was a defense against its inevitable end. This was a project born from a profound, perhaps pathological fear of the grave. The endless accumulation of art and artifacts was not about possession. It was an attempt to acquire history, to surround himself with objects that had already achieved immortality, hoping it would somehow be contagious. Consider the timeline. The project began in 1919 with a simple, almost humble request to Julia Morgan to build something a little more comfortable on the hill. Yet it ballooned into a 28-year construction project that was never officially completed in his lifetime. Why? Because completion was never the true objective. Completion would mean the work was done. It would mean the end. The constant, frantic changes to the design are the most telling clue. Entire wings were constructed, only for Hearst to order them torn down and rebuilt. The famous Neptune pool was designed and built 3 separate times, each iteration grander and more complex than the last. This wasn't the pursuit of architectural perfection. It was the frantic energy of a man who needed the noise of construction to drown out the silence he feared was coming. It was a war against finality. As long as the building was happening, the story wasn't over. This was not a home. It was a distraction. It was a physical manifestation of a refusal to accept the human condition. Every stone laid, every antiquity installed, every tree planted was an act of defiance. This entire mountain was a monument, not to a man's ego, but to his terror. It was a fortress built to withstand a siege from an enemy that was already inside the walls. A fortress built to withstand a siege from an enemy that was already inside the walls. But every fortress, no matter how private, presents a face to the world. And the face of this one was designed not just to impress, but to broadcast a very specific and very calculated message of defiance. To an approaching visitor, the main house, Casa Grande, would slowly resolve out of the coastal haze. It wasn't a mansion that appeared, but something far more imposing. With its soaring twin towers and ornate entrance, it was deliberately designed to evoke the form of a Spanish cathedral. This was not a stylistic whim. It was a statement of intent. Why build your home in the image of a house of God? For a man obsessed with his own mortality, the answer is chillingly clear. Cathedrals are symbols of eternity. They are structures built to outlast generations, to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine. By cloaking his home in the iconography of the church, Hearst was attempting a kind of architectural transference. He was trying to live inside a symbol of everlasting life. This choice anchors the entire architectural language of the estate. The style is a carefully curated blend of Mediterranean revival, a pastiche of Spanish, Moorish, and Italian influences. But it is not a chaotic mix. It is a deliberate summoning of the ghosts of old Europe, of empires and dynasties that had already achieved a form of immortality through their art and architecture. Every archway, every tiled roof, every carved balcony was a piece of a carefully constructed historical fantasy. This wasn't just about showing off wealth. Any new money millionaire could do that. This was about legitimizing that wealth. Hearst, the son of a rough-and-tumble mining baron, was using architecture to buy a pedigree. He was importing a history his family lacked, positioning himself not as a mere American industrialist, but as a rightful heir to Western civilization. He was the modern equivalent of a Medici prince or a Renaissance pope, a collector and custodian of culture. And so the exterior of Hearst Castle became a declaration. It was a message broadcast from his isolated mountain to the turbulent modern world below. It said that here, power was not fleeting. Here, beauty was not temporary. Here, a man could build something as solid and as permanent as the ancient churches of Europe. The facade was the first line of defense, a massive, ornate shield of stone and concrete designed to project an illusion of permanence against the undeniable reality of time. But a shield is just a shell. To make the illusion of permanence feel real, to make it function day after day, you need a machine. And that is precisely what Julia Morgan designed behind the cathedral walls. A vast, intricate social machine, engineered to control not just the perception of time, but the very lives of those within it. To call the interior a home is a profound understatement. It was a private, luxury village. The numbers themselves are staggering and speak to a purpose far beyond domestic living. 165 rooms in total, including 42 bedrooms and 61 bathrooms. It contained a movie theater that rivaled any in Hollywood, a library housing priceless manuscripts, and a dining hall that could seat the titans of industry and politics. This was not a space for family, it was an apparatus for entertainment on an industrial scale. And within this apparatus, life was governed by a strict, unwritten code. Guests, who included everyone from Charlie Chaplin to Winston Churchill, were given the illusion of freedom. During the day, they could ride horses across the vast estate, play tennis on the private courts, or swim in the breathtaking pools. But this freedom was conditional. Come evening, the machine clicked into gear. Attendance at cocktails and then at the formal dinner in the grand refectory was not a request. It was a command. Here, the architecture became a tool of social order. Hearst sat at the center of the long monastery table, the undisputed king at his court. The seating arrangements were a clear map of power and favor. The house itself was organized hierarchically. The most important guests were housed in the 3 opulent guest casas surrounding the main building, while Hearst and his mistress, Marion Davies, occupied the upper floors of Casa Grande, a sanctum of absolute privacy. This was social engineering on a grand scale, a perfectly orchestrated performance night after night. And like any grand performance, the stagecraft had to be invisible. The vast staff of maids, cooks, and groundskeepers who kept the machine running were designed to be unseen and unheard. Their work was organized to be almost supernatural. Rooms were cleaned, meals appeared, and the grounds were manicured as if by magic. This invisibility was crucial to the fantasy. It created a world without effort, a paradise where every need was met before it was even expressed. The house wasn't just a building, it was a meticulously directed stage play, and its interior was the set designed to ensure the director was always in control. But the director's control did not stop at the stone walls. The meticulously managed stage play of the interior was merely the heart of a much larger production. To truly create a world apart, a kingdom immune to the laws of reality, the very land itself had to be conquered and remade in his image. The entire mountain became the set. One must remember what this hill was. It was a dry, sun-baked California landscape covered in chaparral and scrub oak, beautiful in its own rugged way, but fundamentally untamed and unforgiving. It was a place of seasonal drought and searing winds. Nature here was not a gentle partner. It was an adversary. Hearst did not seek to cooperate with it. He sought to subjugate it. This was not gardening. It was a conquest. An entire, mature forest was summoned into existence where none had been before. Thousands of trees, including fully grown Italian cypresses, were hauled for miles and painstakingly planted on the slopes to create the illusion of an ancient Mediterranean estate that had stood for centuries. This was an act of brute force, a declaration that money and will could not just shape the future, but could rewrite the past of the landscape itself. And then there was the question of water, the lifeblood of this impossible oasis. There was no river, no lake on this high perch. So, With Julia Morgan's engineering brilliance, a complex system of pipelines was constructed to bring water down from the Santa Lucia Mountains miles away. It was a colossal undertaking, a hidden circulatory system that allowed 127 acres of intricate terraced gardens, esplanades, and blossoming flower beds to flourish in defiance of the arid climate. Nowhere is this war against nature more evident than in the saga of the Neptune Pool. It is, perhaps, the most famous swimming pool in the world, an impossibly grand basin framed by an authentic Roman temple facade that Hearst imported piece by piece from Europe. But it wasn't built just once. It was designed, built, torn down, and completely rebuilt 3 times over a period of 12 years. This was not due to failure. It was due to the relentless expansion of a vision that refused to accept any limits, including its own previous iterations. Each version had to be grander, more perfect, more divine. The pool was not a place for swimming. It was the ultimate theater of this war, a stage where water, marble, and classical antiquity were bent to the will of one man. The subjugation of the landscape was more than a hobby. It was a declaration of dominance over the natural order of things. It was a desperate attempt to prove that if a man could command the earth and the water, perhaps he could command his own fate. And if one could prove his command over the earth and the water, the final, most crucial element to control was the human one. The meticulously terraformed landscape was not just for private enjoyment. It was the backdrop for the most exclusive and rigidly controlled theater in the world. The castle was a stage, and for 2 decades its guest list was a roll call of global power. During the roaring 20s and the grim 30s, as the world outside lurched between excess and despair, this remote hilltop became an unofficial capital. Hollywood royalty, like Charlie Chaplin, Cary Grant, and Greta Garbo, mingled with political titans like Winston Churchill and Calvin Coolidge. It was the ultimate salon, the place where the threads of media, politics, and culture were woven together under the watchful eye of a single host. But to be a guest here was to be an actor in a highly structured play. The social calendar was a machine, as carefully engineered as the estate's water supply. The days offered a facade of freedom, but the evenings were immutable ritual. It began with cocktails in the assembly room, a massive chamber filled with priceless tapestries where guests were expected to mingle. This was not a casual affair, it was an overture. The main act was dinner in the refectory. Here, seated on ancient Spanish choir stalls at a long monastery table, the performance reached its peak. Hearst, the director, sat at the center, dictating the flow of conversation. He controlled everything, from the guest list to the menu, even the condiments. Humble paper napkins and bottles of ketchup sat incongruously beside priceless silver. This was a subtle but constant reminder of who was in charge. This was his table, his world, his rules. After dinner, the cast would move to the private movie theater for a screening, often a premiere of a film that the public would not see for months. The ritual was absolute. This was not a party. It was a meticulously scheduled, repeatable performance designed to create a perfect, unchanging world. The price of admission to this fantasy was a tacit agreement to play your assigned role, to submit to the director's vision. The entire social life of the castle was the final, most complex layer of the fortress, a wall of noise and glamour built to prove that here a man could command not just nature, but reality itself. But the power to command reality on a remote California hilltop was not the source of his wealth. It was the result of it. The castle was merely a scale model of a much larger and far dirtier machine, an empire built not on stone, but on ink and fear. To understand how this fortress of tranquility was paid for, you must look down from the pristine mountain and into the chaotic, grimy streets of America's great cities. There, the engine of the Hearst Empire roared day and night. It was an empire of paper. At its zenith, dozens of newspapers and magazines, a vast network designed not just to report the news, but to create it. This was the machinery of yellow journalism, a term Hearst himself helped to invent. The business model was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. It was the industrial-scale manufacturing of sensation. Facts were not the product. Emotion was. The goal was to provoke, to shock, to enrage, to terrify. A small spark of truth would be drenched in the gasoline of exaggeration and lit with a screaming, all-caps headline. Complex issues were flattened into simple morality plays of heroes and villains. Every priceless object in the castle has a shadow cost, paid for in this debased currency. The funds used to import a 16th-century Spanish ceiling were generated by a headline that destroyed a political career. The money to acquire an ancient Roman sarcophagus was earned by sensationalizing a murder trial beyond all recognition. The entire idyllic world of San Simeon was a fantasy bankrolled by a system that thrived on public anxiety. The ultimate expression of this power was its ability to shape not just opinions, but national destiny. The Spanish-American War of 1898 is the most infamous example. Hearst's papers relentlessly beat the drums of war, using sensationalized and often fabricated stories of Spanish atrocities in Cuba to ignite public outrage. He saw that war sold papers, and he used his vast machinery to give the public the conflict they had been conditioned to crave. This empire was not just a business, it was a weapon. Hearst wielded it without mercy to crush his rivals, to promote his own political ambitions, and to protect his business interests. It was an engine of propaganda that ran on scandal, innuendo, and character assassination. The serene, timeless beauty of the castle, with its imported history and enforced tranquility, was the direct beneficiary of this brutal, modern, and relentlessly noisy machine. The peace on the mountain was paid for by the chaos in the city. The peace on the mountain was paid for by the chaos in the city. For decades, that machine of chaos had been Hearst's private weapon, a tool to build his fortune and destroy his enemies. He was the undisputed master of shaping the public narrative. But in 1941, a new kind of machine, a new form of media, would turn that weapon back on its creator with devastating force. The attack came not from a rival newspaper, but from a dark room in a Hollywood studio. It was orchestrated by a 25-year-old prodigy named Orson Welles. The weapon was a film, a work of fiction that would become more real than the truth itself. It was called Citizen Kane. The film never mentions William Randolph Hearst by name. It didn't have to. The parallels were surgical and they were brutal. The story centered on a lonely, tyrannical newspaper magnate, Charles Foster Kane, who inherits a fortune and builds an empire. The true target, however, was not just the man, but his life's great work, his castle. In the film, it is called Xanadu, a vast, monstrous, and ultimately empty palace built on a private mountain filled with the stolen art of a continent, a place of staggering beauty and profound isolation. It was described in the film's opening as a private pleasure dome, but what Welles showed on screen was a prison, a gilded cage where an old man wanders, haunted by his past, surrounded by statues that cannot offer him comfort. This was not a critique. It was a psychological autopsy. The film captured the very essence of Hearst's deepest fears: the loneliness, the futility of his endless collecting, the terror of a life ending in regret. Welles had somehow seen past the glamorous facade and identified the hollow core. He had discovered the secret that the fortress was built to hide. Hearst's reaction was not one of annoyance. It was one of pure, unrestrained fury. This was the ultimate violation. The sanctity of his private kingdom, the one place on earth he could completely control, had been breached. An outsider had not only trespassed, but had broadcast its secrets, real or imagined, to the entire world. He unleashed the full force of his media empire in an attempt to kill the film. It was one of the most vicious suppression campaigns in Hollywood history. He forbade any of his newspapers or radio stations from running advertisements or even mentioning the movie's existence. He leveraged his immense political power, threatening the entire studio system with investigations and scandal-mongering if they dared to distribute Wells's masterpiece. But he failed. The weapon of media had evolved. The power of a moving picture, of a perfectly crafted story, proved to be more potent than 1,000 angry headlines. Hearst, the master of public image, had lost control of his own. The film survived, and in doing so, it worked a terrible kind of magic. It fused the fictional character of Charles Foster Kane with the real man, William Randolph Hearst, forever. The public could no longer see one without the other. The castle on the hill was no longer just Hearst Castle. It was now, and would always be, Xanadu. The ghost of Kane would walk its halls for eternity. The carefully constructed narrative of a grand American life had been overwritten by a tragic story of failure. The fortress had been breached, not by an army, but by a story projected onto a screen. A story projected onto a screen can wound a man's pride, his legacy. It can create a ghost that will haunt his creation forever. But a story cannot seize his assets. A story cannot silence the hammers. For that, a much older and more relentless enemy was required, an enemy that had been lurking within the castle's ledgers from the very first day, the cold, unforgiving logic of arithmetic. For decades, William Randolph Hearst had operated as if money were not a resource to be managed, but a force of nature to be commanded, like the wind or the tides. His empire was a river of gold, and he diverted it towards his mountain with little thought for the source. Every purchase was an impulse, every construction project an act of will. The castle itself was the ultimate monument to this belief in infinite resources. It was an economic anomaly, a project without a budget, without a deadline, and without any connection to the financial realities of the world below. But that world could not be held at bay forever. The Great Depression was not a distant headline. It was a seismic shockwave that cracked the very foundations of the Hearst Empire. Advertising revenues, the lifeblood of his newspapers and magazines, evaporated. The public, his audience, was suddenly more concerned with breadlines than with sensational stories. The machine that generated the chaos that paid for the peace on the mountain began to sputter and seize, and the castle, his great obsession, became a hemorrhage of cash. The constant shipping of European antiquities, the payroll for an army of craftsmen, the sheer cost of defying nature on a barren hilltop. It was an unsustainable burn rate in a world suddenly starved of capital. His personal spending was an addiction, and the bill was finally coming due. The numbers, when they were finally tallied, were apocalyptic. By 1937, the man who had lectured presidents and dictated national policy was personally in debt to the tune of more than $95 million. In today's terms, that is a figure well over $1.5 billion. It was a debt so vast, it could have financed a small nation. It was a black hole, and it was threatening to swallow everything he had built. The end of his reign was not dramatic. There was no single, cataclysmic event. It was a quiet, humiliating surrender. To avoid total collapse, Hearst was forced to cede control of his financial empire to a group of outside trustees. Accountants and lawyers, men who cared for balance sheets and not for beauty, now held the reins. The king was in receivership. Their first order of business was to stop the bleeding, and the single greatest wound was the castle. In 1937, the construction ground to a halt. The noise that had been Hearst's constant companion for nearly 2 decades, the sound of building, the sound of becoming, the sound of defiance, was replaced by an unnerving silence. The project was frozen in a state of perpetual incompletion, a testament not to his vision, but to his ruin. He would regain some control after the war, and some limited work would resume, but the spell was broken, the dream was over, and then came the final, most intimate defeat. The fortress, designed to be a bastion against the world, was utterly defenseless against the failures of the human body. As his health declined in the late 1940s, the isolation he had so carefully engineered became his prison. The remote mountain lacked the advanced medical facilities he now desperately needed to survive. In 1947, the king was forced into exile from his own kingdom. He left the mountain for the last time, not for a party in Hollywood or a meeting in New York, but to be closer to doctors in Beverly Hills. The great fortress against the end had become a tomb he couldn't even occupy. The war had been fought on 2 fronts, finance and biology, and he had lost them both. The war had been fought on 2 fronts, finance and biology, and he had lost them both. The king was dead, and now the great fortress on the hill, the ultimate expression of his will, was silent. It was a kingdom without a king, a body without a soul, and it faced a question every great monument faces upon the death of its creator. Will it become a ruin or a relic? For 6 years after William Randolph Hearst's death in 1951, the castle existed in a state of limbo. It was no longer a home, but it was not yet a museum. For the Hearst Corporation, which now controlled the asset, it was a magnificent and impossibly expensive problem. A private village filled with priceless art, sitting on a remote peak, consuming a fortune in maintenance. It was a liability, a ghost of a past era with no purpose in the modern world. The solution, executed in 1957, was a masterstroke of strategic divestment presented as public service. The corporation gifted the castle and its immediate grounds, 127 acres of the most developed and costly real estate, to the people of the state of California. The private fortress, built as an impenetrable sanctuary from the masses, was to be handed over to them. The final, and perhaps greatest irony in the castle's history, was about to unfold. In 1958, the gates of La Cuesta Encantada were formally opened to the public. The winding road, once reserved for Hollywood royalty and political titans, was now filled with the cars of ordinary families. The machine designed for absolute privacy had been re-engineered for mass tourism. The very purpose of the place was inverted. The fortress built to keep the world out would now survive by inviting the world in. What the public found was a world frozen in time, a diorama of a life that had abruptly ended. The rooms were preserved as Hearst had left them, but they were no longer living spaces. They were exhibits. The grand refectory was no longer a stage for power dinners, but a silent tableau. The movie theater would no longer show Hollywood premieres, but would remain dark. The castle had survived, but its function had been extinguished. It had become a beautiful corpse. But even this corpse is not entirely whole. The collection we see today is a survivor of a great purge. We must not forget the desperate sell-off during the financial collapse of the 1930s. To satisfy his creditors, Hearst was forced to auction off thousands of pieces from his collection. Entire rooms, tapestries, suits of armor, and priceless antiquities were sold to the highest bidder. The castle was wounded, its collection bled, long before its master died. The treasure that remains is what was left after the hemorrhage. It is a stunning, world-class accumulation of art, but it is an edited version of the original obsessive vision. It is a monument defined as much by what is absent as by what is present. The empty spaces on the walls and the sold-off artifacts are ghosts that haunt the collection, a permanent reminder that even a king's fortress is vulnerable to the brute force of a balance sheet. Yet, the most critical artifacts were never sold because they had no market value. The true key to understanding the castle, the data recorder of its entire 28-year creation, was not made of marble or gold. It was made of paper. The archives, the letters, the blueprints, the invoices, the telegrams were the real treasure. This is where the story lives. This paper trail contains the real dialogue of creation. It is the unfiltered, decades-long conversation between the client with an infinite imagination and the architect with an impossible task. The frantic, late-night telegrams from Hearst and the patient, methodical responses from Julia Morgan. Here, in these documents, the fantasy gives way to the gritty reality of logistics, engineering, and sheer human effort. This evidence, the raw data of the dream, has been preserved. It lies dormant in the castle's own on-site archive and, most significantly, within the special collections of the Kennedy Library at California Polytechnic State University in nearby San Luis Obispo. Away from the tourist crowds, this is where the real fortress can be excavated. The stone castle is the spectacle, but the paper archive is the secret. The spectacle of the stone is what draws the crowds, but the secret, buried in the paper of the archives, is what holds the true lesson. Why does this place, this opulent ghost on a lonely hill, matter now? Because it is not a story about success. It is the most magnificent monument to failure ever constructed. Ultimately, this is the story of a war that could never be won. It was a war waged not against a business competitor or a political rival, but against the fundamental anxieties of the human condition, loneliness and the terror of oblivion. Hearst possessed a fortune that was, for all practical purposes, limitless. He had the power to shape the thoughts of a nation, and he aimed all of that colossal firepower at the one enemy it could not defeat. He wielded wealth and power as weapons against his own mortality. He built a fortress of art and history, hoping to live inside of it, to insulate himself from the passage of time. The castle stands as the most expensive proof in history that you cannot build a physical fortress to protect you from a metaphysical fear. You cannot buy your way out of the human condition. The great and terrible irony is that the very defenses he built became his prison. The isolation he engineered for control became the cage of his final, frail years. The man who spent his life surrounded by thousands of priceless objects died in exile from his greatest creation, proving that a life spent acquiring things is not the same as a life spent living. The fortress, in the end, kept nothing out, but it locked him in. And what of the legacy he fought so hard to build, to control? His story demonstrates a terrifyingly modern truth. The narrative you create about yourself is fragile. The story that endures is often the one told about you by others, especially by your most perceptive enemies. Hearst, the master manipulator of the printed word, was ultimately defeated by a new and more powerful form of storytelling. His fortress of stone was conquered by a ghost made of light and shadow. The fictional tragedy of Charles Foster Kane became more potent, more real in the public imagination than the actual life of William Randolph Hearst. He teaches us that we do not own our own stories after we are gone. They are inherited and often rewritten by others. But perhaps the most vital lesson of the castle is the one that was never intended. If you look past the gilded ego of its owner, you see that this is also a monument to the quiet, relentless competence that so often exists in the shadow of loud, chaotic ambition. It is a monument to Julia Morgan. Her legacy forces us to look past the name on the gate and ask the fundamental question of any historical investigation. Who actually did the work? Who solved the problems? Who turned the impossible dream into a physical reality? It is a reminder that history is filled with indispensable figures who have been rendered invisible, and that the work of any true investigator is to bring their names back into the light. So the castle teaches us about fear, about narrative, and about the nature of true genius. The blueprints for this understanding are not locked away. They reside in the public archives at Cal Poly and the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. They are there for anyone willing to look. History survives only when we pay attention. These investigations into the hidden architecture of power and ambition are not simple. They require time, resources, and a commitment to looking beyond the official story. They require a belief that understanding the past is the only way to make sense of the present. If you believe this work is important, if these explorations into the forgotten corners of history matter to you, then please support this channel. Like this video, subscribe, and share this investigation with anyone who you think needs to see it. Your support is the foundation upon which these explorations are built. And most importantly, tell me in the comments, what fortress should we investigate next? What empire's secrets are waiting to be unearthed? What forgotten name needs to be brought back into the light? I'm waiting.